In my family, we harbor a terrible secret. This all happened about a year ago. An elderly couple moved in next door. They used to live in Tokyo, but they moved to the countryside to live out their final years, as they put it. They wanted to be surrounded by nature. When I heard I was getting some new neighbors, I was initially apprehensive, but when I met them, I knew there would be no trouble. The husband of the couple used to regularly walk around the neighborhood. I saw him often. The wife would come over from time to time with some food. She would say, "I've cooked a bit too much. Why don't you have some?" It was a nice neighborly gesture. The flavors and seasoning that old lady used next door were out of this world. Everything she made was delicious. My husband and my 2 children would often ask at dinner time if there was any side dishes from next door, and when there wasn't any, they always looked upset. My parents and my husband's parents lived far away, so it was really nice to have a kind of grandmother figure popping in with some delicious treats now and then. They weren't causing us any trouble. After a while, we became quite close. This lasted for about a year. I noticed that we hadn't seen the old lady's husband for a while though. I thought it strange. I asked my husband if he had seen him. He said he thought he saw him in a park recently or outside gardening, but he couldn't be certain. I suggested we ask the old lady if he was okay. Maybe he was sick or something. The next day, she arrived at our house with a stew. My husband asked about her husband, and she said that he was suffering in the summer heat, and he had been staying indoors a lot more lately. We all tucked into the delicious stew she had brought over. It was the best one yet. I've never tasted anything that delicious in my life. The kids squabbled over second and third helpings. I was surprised. I mean, how could I not be able to replicate the flavors in her food? And I asked her to teach me how to cook as well as her, and I followed the instructions to the letter, but something wasn't quite the same. It was never as good as hers. It really bothered me. I guessed I wasn't as talented as her. I was cooking when I heard the siren outside. I was terribly worried, and I thought it was an ambulance for the old man next door. I asked my husband, and he said, "That's not an ambulance's siren." He said it was a police car siren. We went to take a look outside. The police had stopped outside our neighbor's house, and they were leading the old lady outside to the police car. Just before they put her in the police car, she looked right at me, dead in the eyes. She threw her head back and laughed. It was such a disturbing laugh. It chilled me to the bone. I distrusted her immediately. It made my heart sink. A detective approached an hour or 2 later and asked us to cooperate with his investigation by answering some questions. He filled us in on the situation. Our neighbor's husband's sister had grown concerned about his well-being, since she hadn't heard from him for some time, about 2 months. She had tried to contact him and left messages with his wife, but he never returned the calls. The old man next door's brother and sister came to visit my neighbors, and that's when they grew more and more suspicious. They noticed a dark stain on the carpet in the house, and they called the police as they suspected the old lady of murder. The detective believed that a murder had been committed, and the old lady had hidden the old man's body. He said, "No matter how hard we look, we cannot find the body. No body, no case. I don't think one elderly person could have moved it too far. She must have done something else with his remains." When I heard him say those words, I must have turned as pale as a ghost. I looked over at my husband, and I could tell we were thinking the same thoughts. The food from next door. The most recent dishes had been full of meat. That delicious meat stew. That night, my husband and I threw up in separate bathrooms. I asked him what we should do about the situation, and he said there's nothing we can do. We decided to stay silent, as we didn't want to incriminate ourselves. I mean, how would our family be seen in society if we told the truth? The media would be all over us. Our kids' lives would be ruined. This may be a difficult thing to understand, but this is what we chose to do. But we couldn't tell the children either. We couldn't let them live with that. The kids are such hard work lately. They don't want to eat anything. They're growing aggressive. and somewhat barbaric. They just keep asking for the neighbor's stew. This happened when I was in the 3rd year of elementary school, when my family and I lived in a small apartment. We rented the place on a temporary basis since our house was getting renovated. It was an old, musty apartment, but it wasn't too far from our house, and the neighbors seemed nice enough. There were tenants either side of us. On one side, there was a lovely old couple, and on the other side, there was a miserable man, and who we guessed was his grandmother. The grandmother was really kind and friendly. She often spoke with my parents. The younger man had, dare I say, some sort of problem I couldn't put my finger on. He always had an odd expression on his face. He looked troubled. He was quite conspicuous. Let me give you some examples. He would pace up and down the apartment hall, again and again. He would mutter to himself in the elevator, and sometimes he would even lay down on the floor of the elevator. It was about January time when we started to see less and less of those two next door. By March, it was as if they had both disappeared. I guess they had just moved out. Then one day, when I was coming back from school, I felt as if someone was staring at me, or I was being watched. Just something seemed wrong. Then I realized what that feeling was. The door to my strange neighbor's apartment was slightly ajar. I thought it was odd because the doors in our apartment block have an automatic lock, so it's not even possible to leave it open ajar. So I guess someone could be behind the door and they were holding it open. Either that or something was blocking the automatic swing shut. I wondered if there was a thief in there, and maybe if I should close the door just in case anybody was thinking of robbing the place. When I got a bit closer to the door, it suddenly slammed shut. It really surprised me, but I pushed it to the back of my mind and settled down. I guess there wasn't a problem after all. But when I returned home from school to find the same door open ajar again, I was a bit freaked out. This time, I noticed that there was someone behind the door, so I quickly rushed home. When my parents came home, I told them about the neighbor's apartment. I said that I thought someone might be in there. My parents believed that the neighbors must still be living there, and they really didn't pay attention to my story. I knew that I hadn't seen either of my neighbors, but my parents said they had heard some noise next door, so they believed that the grandma-grandson combination was still there. For a long time, all I can remember is that when I came home from school, my neighbor's door was ajar, and I guess I kinda got used to it. When I left in the morning, it was closed, but when I came back, it was just slightly open. After a while, I began to come to terms with the idea that it may not be a robber next door and things went back to normal. One day I invited a friend back to play some video games after school, and as we walked down the building's corridor, yep, you guessed it, the neighbor's door was slightly open. I didn't pay it much mind at this point. We were walking past the neighbor's door when an arm burst through the gap in the door and grabbed me. I was being pulled into the neighbor's apartment. I was pulled violently into the door frame. I screamed. I tried to make as much noise as I could, and I resisted with all my might. My friend came to my aid. He had one of those hand forks, like for digging in the garden. He jammed it into the strange arm that had grabbed me. A voice screamed from the other side of the door, and the arm suddenly retracted. At this point, my friend and I ran as fast as we could into my apartment, and we locked the door. We were so happy to be safe inside, but too terrified to think of ever going outside again at that point. We thought of calling someone, but we didn't know who to call. We thought we might get in trouble if we called the police. So we tried to distract ourselves by playing the game we were supposed to play after school, but we weren't really in the mood. At about 5 o'clock, my mother came home. I explained what had happened in a panic. To begin with, she didn't believe me. It was only when my friend defended me that she believed us. It got late and my mother drove my friend home. I didn't know this at the time, but my friend told me at a later date that when they walked past my neighbor's apartment, the door was open ajar. My mother called the building owner to complain and make him aware. When I overheard that conversation while I was watching TV, I was relieved. So my dad came back and he said he had to nip out again because he forgot something. Weird. Suddenly, a cacophony of noise roused from next door. Later that night, routine went back to normal. I had dinner, a bath, got ready for bed. Something was a bit different though. I didn't see my dad at all that night. From that day forward, I never saw the next door neighbors again. And to this day, I don't know if it was the neighbor who grabbed me and tried to pull me into that dark apartment, or someone else. My dad won't tell me what happened either. But being my curious self, I asked the landlord about what had happened before we moved back to our house. I found out that when he went to check over the next door neighbor's apartment, he found a large number of photos taken of young boys. Not photos where they were happy and smiling, but photos taken when the children in question weren't looking. Photos taken secretly. Photos taken through the gap in the door. There were a large number of photos of me, and it really scares me that that man could be still out there. The creepiest thing the landlord said to me was that there were 2 nooses suspended from the ceiling. What did that person have planned for me if they had successfully dragged me into next door's apartment? This happened when I lived in a 2-story apartment. It was about 30 years old. It was in a great location, right by the train station, and the rent was cheaper than all the other buildings in town. Naturally, the living conditions were poor, and the other residents weren't exactly high society. There was an old man who seemed to spend every waking moment coughing or clearing his throat. There was a foreign couple who fought all hours of the night in a language I didn't understand. As for me, back then, I was young and I was only working part-time, and I didn't have much of an income. Something strange started happening. It wasn't big to begin with. I remember thinking one day, I'm sure I didn't take out the garbage, but the bin was empty. Seriously, was someone stealing the garbage? I asked myself, and I realized how dumb that sounded, so I put it to the back of my mind. But when it happened again, I was a little concerned, to say the least. Who was throwing out the garbage, and why would someone do that? It was weird, but actually not that much of an inconvenience. It only started to get really spooky when some of my underwear went missing. And then a couple of days later, something else happened. The dirty dishes in my sink were washed, and I definitely remember not doing that. It was weird. I questioned my own power of recollection at this point. One day I came home from work a little earlier than usual because I wasn't feeling too well. I unlocked my door, and that's when I saw her. There was a woman sat at my kitchen table licking a pair of my chopsticks. I was so shocked I immediately left without saying a word. One of my neighbors called the police for me. They arrived pretty quickly. I explained what had happened, and they went to investigate while I waited outside. I heard a woman scream in there, and after a few moments, she was brought out. She was clearly under arrest. The next day, the police called to let me know what had happened. The woman they had arrested was my next-door neighbor. She lived alone. I was told that she was suffering from mental illness and was now in hospital. Because the apartment block was so old, she had found a way into my apartment through the adjoining wall. She would stand on her wardrobe, push a panel aside, and climb into my apartment. She told the police the reason that she did it was because she was in love with me. Now, I found this so hard to believe since the first time I laid eyes on her was when she was being arrested. She had long dark hair and she was so skinny. The officer told me that it would be best if I moved since they couldn't arrest her on account of her mental disorder. And it did worry me that one day she might come back. Luckily, a friend let me stay with him, so I went back to my apartment to quickly box up some of my belongings. About half a year later, when I finally got around to sorting out some of my old stuff from the boxes I had packed up before I left, I came across my photo album. I flipped through it for nostalgia's sake, and I felt a chill run up my spine when I found that my creepy neighbor had cut my sister out of a photo and put her own photo in its place. It was a photo of me with my arm around my sister. My creepy neighbor is still out there somewhere. I hope we never meet again. This happened when I was a university student. I rented an apartment and lived alone back then. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or someone who has any supernatural experiences, but something at night would wake me up, and I would hear a sound like this. It was a really odd sound. It wasn't something I could blame on electric or street noise outside. I thought it was definitely in the room, and I got really freaked out every time I heard it. But I only heard it once to begin with. It kind of went to the back of my mind for about a week until I heard it again. This time, I didn't hear it in the dead of night. It was only about 9 o'clock. I was already in bed though. I wasn't feeling great. I realized that the source of the sound was coming from the balcony. It wasn't exactly the same sound I was familiar with, but it certainly was similar. I looked over to the balcony and saw a figure out there, just behind the curtain. Due to how odd the sound was, I initially thought it might be a ghost or something. I was too terrified to move. Then I heard. It sounded as if someone was punching on the window with all their might. I looked over, and there was a shadow against my balcony window. It looked like the shadow hammering on my window had a knife in its hand. I feared for my life. I jumped out of bed and ran barefoot as fast as I could. I frantically banged on the owner of the building's door. I explained to him what had happened, and he called the police for me. 2 officers arrived, and the landlord and I accompanied them to the room. The police tried to quietly open the door, but found that it was locked. They asked me if I had locked it, and I said, of course not. I didn't even bring shoes. The key is in the room. One of the officers seemed to take issue with this, and he fixed me with a glare and said, "Did you really see something in there? Because something must have locked this door." "Of course I did," I replied. I was still in panic mode, and this cop wasn't helping me to calm down. It really annoyed me that he didn't believe me. The landlord came back from his room with a master key. We watched with bated breath as the landlord unlocked the door. As the door swung open, it revealed a crazed woman stood in my room, brandishing a kitchen knife. I recognized her. It was my neighbor. "Don't come in here, you're gonna kill me," she shouted, amongst other random words and phrases which made no sense. When the police tried to approach her to calm her down, she rushed back to the balcony and clambered over it. She seemed to disappear almost instantly. I thought in that moment that she had fallen. I lived on the 2nd floor, by the way. I heard a dull thud. We all hurried to the balcony and looked down. She had the knife stuck in her thigh, and she was writhing in pain. Or perhaps it was anger. This was the scariest thing that had ever happened to me. If I didn't run to the landlord's apartment, I don't think I'd still be alive today. Later I heard from the landlord that the noise I had heard in my apartment before that fateful night was probably coming from her room, as there were slashes in the wall facing my room. I still don't know why she did it, but I'm happy to hear that she is getting some help and she isn't a danger to anyone out there at the moment. In the 3 months I had lived next door to her, we had only exchanged greetings to each other in passing. I knew nothing about her. 3 months ago, I was a normal person, and so was she. So guys, be careful out there. And don't forget to ask yourself now and then, how well do you know your neighbors?